In 2008, SpaceX was one launch away from disappearing. 3 rockets had already failed. Elon Musk was running out of money. Tesla was struggling too. And there was only one rocket left. If Falcon 1 failed again, SpaceX was finished. No Falcon 9, no Dragon, no Starlink, no Starship, nothing. But just weeks after that final launch, NASA would make a decision worth approximately $1.6 billion. A decision that would transform SpaceX from a desperate startup into one of the most powerful companies in the space industry. Today, NASA working with SpaceX seems completely normal. Astronauts launch on Dragon. Falcon 9 launches satellites almost every week. SpaceX has become a dominant force in commercial spaceflight. But in 2008, choosing SpaceX was anything but obvious. NASA already had established aerospace giants with decades of experience. Boeing and Lockheed Martin had built some of the most important rockets in American history. SpaceX had failed 3 times. So why would NASA trust a company that had barely survived long enough to reach orbit? The answer begins with a rocket that almost killed the company. In 2002, Elon Musk founded SpaceX with an idea that sounded unrealistic from the beginning. He believed spaceflight was far too expensive, and if humanity wanted to become a spacefaring civilization, the cost had to come down dramatically. Musk initially wanted to send a small greenhouse to Mars to generate public interest in space exploration. But when he explored buying Russian rockets for the mission, the negotiations went badly. The prices were far higher than he expected. On the flight home, Musk started calculating something that changed his plans completely. The raw materials inside a rocket represented only a fraction of the price customers were paying to launch it. If rockets were so expensive, why not build them differently? Instead of buying a rocket, Musk decided to build one himself. That decision created SpaceX. But there was a problem. Musk had money. SpaceX had ambition. What it didn't have was experience. Boeing had decades of aerospace knowledge. Lockheed Martin had decades of aerospace knowledge. NASA had decades of experience launching spacecraft. SpaceX had none of that. It had a small team, limited resources, and an untested rocket called Falcon 1. The goal was simple: reach orbit. The reality would be brutal. On March 24, 2006, Falcon 1 lifted off from Omelek Island in the Pacific. For the first moments, everything looked promising. Then a fuel leak caused an engine fire. The engine lost thrust. The rocket began to roll. Less than a minute after launch, Falcon 1 crashed. For an established aerospace company, a failure was a major setback. For SpaceX, it was a warning that the entire company was still unproven. Critics immediately questioned whether a private startup could really build an orbital rocket. But inside SpaceX, engineers weren't looking for excuses. They were looking for data. They examined the telemetry, found the problem, redesigned the system, and prepared another rocket. Less than a year later, Falcon 1 returned. And this time it went much farther. The rocket successfully lifted off and climbed toward orbit. SpaceX was getting close. Then the next failure appeared. During stage separation, the stages collided. The rocket lost control, and the mission ended without reaching orbit. 2 attempts, 2 failures, and the company had already spent years trying to make Falcon 1 work. The third launch had to succeed. Instead, it became even more painful. By 2008, SpaceX was running out of money, and Elon Musk had another company demanding his attention. Tesla was also facing a financial crisis. Musk wasn't simply trying to grow 2 companies, he was trying to keep both alive. Then on August 3, 2008, Falcon 1 launched for the 3rd time. This time, the rocket looked ready. The first stage completed its burn. Everything appeared to be working. Then came stage separation. The first stage unexpectedly made contact with the second stage. The rocket began spinning out of control. The mission was lost. 3 launches, 3 failures. At that moment, SpaceX had a reputation for exactly one thing: failing to reach orbit. But inside the company, something was different. Each failure had revealed another problem, and now the engineers knew exactly what they had to fix. There was only one obstacle left: money. SpaceX couldn't afford endless attempts. Elon Musk had enough resources for essentially one final Falcon 1 launch. One rocket, one chance. If it failed, there might be no fifth attempt. That meant everything SpaceX had built since 2002 was about to be decided in a matter of minutes. On September 28, 2008, Falcon 1 stood on the launch pad. This wasn't just another test. It was the last chance. The countdown began. Engines ignited. Falcon 1 lifted off. The first stage burned. The rocket climbed higher. Then came the moment that had destroyed the previous mission: stage separation. This time, the stages separated cleanly. The second stage ignited. Falcon 1 continued upward. Seconds passed, then minutes, and finally, the impossible happened. Falcon 1 reached orbit. SpaceX had succeeded. After 3 consecutive failures, the company had finally placed a liquid-fueled rocket into orbit. Engineers jumped from their seats. People hugged. Some simply stared at the screens. Elon Musk had spent years and a huge portion of his personal fortune trying to make SpaceX work. Now, for the first time, the company had proof. It could reach orbit, but there was a problem. One successful launch didn't make SpaceX a major aerospace company. It needed customers. It needed funding. And more than anything, it needed someone important enough to believe the company could do this again. That someone was NASA. At the time, NASA was facing a major transition. The Space Shuttle program was approaching retirement, but NASA still needed reliable transportation for cargo going to the International Space Station. For decades, NASA had relied heavily on large aerospace contractors, but the agency was beginning to explore a different model. Instead of developing every transportation system itself, NASA could become a customer and allow commercial companies to build the vehicles. The idea could potentially reduce costs and create competition. But there was an obvious question. Which companies could NASA actually trust? SpaceX had only one successful orbital launch. One. Its previous 3 attempts had exploded or failed. From the outside, choosing SpaceX looked risky. But the 4th Falcon 1 launch had changed something important. SpaceX had finally demonstrated that its technology worked, and the company was offering something the traditional industry desperately needed: a different approach to cost, development speed, and engineering. NASA didn't need another company that simply copied the old system. It needed companies willing to create a new one. SpaceX now had a chance, but it still had to win the contract. In December 2008, NASA announced the winners of its Commercial Resupply Services program. SpaceX was selected. The agreement was worth approximately $1.6 billion. Just months earlier, SpaceX had been one failed launch away from collapse. Now NASA was committing billions of dollars to its future missions. The contract gave SpaceX something even more valuable than money: credibility. NASA was no longer just watching SpaceX from the outside. It was becoming a customer. That relationship helped fund the development of Falcon 9 and Dragon, giving SpaceX the resources to build systems far more ambitious than Falcon 1. But there was a deeper reason this decision mattered. NASA wasn't simply giving SpaceX a contract, it was giving the company an opportunity to fly repeatedly, and repeated launches meant more experience, more data, and more opportunities to improve. SpaceX had survived because it learned from failure. Now NASA had given it a reason to keep learning, but Elon Musk had a much bigger problem in mind. Even if SpaceX could launch rockets successfully, every rocket was still being thrown away. And Musk thought that made no sense. Imagine buying an airplane, flying it once, and throwing it away. Nobody would accept that. Yet rockets had operated that way for decades. A rocket would launch, deliver its payload, and the expensive hardware would fall back to Earth. The next mission required another rocket. Musk believed that had to change. SpaceX wanted to recover the first stage, land it vertically, inspect it, and fly it again. The concept was simple to explain and incredibly difficult to execute. A booster returning from space had to control its descent through the atmosphere, survive extreme forces, restart its engines, navigate precisely, and land upright on a small target. The margin for error was tiny. SpaceX failed repeatedly. Boosters crashed into the ocean. Others exploded during landing attempts. But every failure generated data. The company wasn't simply trying the same thing again. It was changing the design after every attempt. Then, on December 21, 2015, Falcon 9 launched into space and completed its mission. Instead of disappearing into the ocean, the first stage turned around, descended toward Earth, and landed vertically. SpaceX had done something the industry had spent decades believing was impractical. It had recovered an orbital-class rocket booster. But the real revolution hadn't happened yet. Landing a rocket once was impressive. Flying it again was the real test. Instead of manufacturing a completely new booster for every mission, SpaceX began reusing the same hardware. Launch, land, inspect, refurbish, fly again. Each successful flight created more experience. Each landing reduced the cost of future missions. And each launch gave SpaceX another opportunity to improve its system. This created something the traditional model struggled to match: a continuous feedback loop. More launches produced more data produced better rockets produced more reliable launches attracted more customers, and more customers created more resources for development. SpaceX wasn't simply building rockets anymore. It was building a system designed to improve with every flight. That advantage became even more powerful when SpaceX started using its own rockets for another massive project. Starlink. SpaceX began launching thousands of satellites for Starlink, its own satellite internet network. This created a business model unlike a traditional launch provider. Other rocket companies had to find customers for their launches. SpaceX could also launch for itself. Every Falcon 9 mission could carry commercial satellites, government payloads, or Starlink satellites. And every Starlink launch expanded another SpaceX business. That meant the company's rockets weren't just transportation, they were infrastructure for a larger ecosystem. The same company was building rockets, launching rockets, recovering rockets, and deploying its own satellite network. Then SpaceX started pushing towards something even bigger: Starship. A massive reusable spacecraft designed for missions far beyond low Earth orbit. The goal was no longer simply to deliver cargo into space. It was to create a transportation system capable of supporting missions to the Moon and eventually Mars. The ambitions sounded familiar. People had called Falcon 1 impossible. They had called reusable rockets impossible. SpaceX had heard that word before. But by now, the company had developed a different response. Don't argue. Build it. Test it. Find out what breaks. Fix it. Try again. Looking back, NASA's decision to choose SpaceX can seem inevitable. It wasn't. In 2008, SpaceX had failed 3 times. The company was nearly out of money. Falcon 1 had only just reached orbit, and there was no guarantee that the next rocket would work. NASA could have continued relying entirely on established aerospace contractors. Instead, it took a risk on a young company that was willing to operate differently. That decision didn't magically make SpaceX successful. SpaceX still had to build Falcon 9. It still had to make Dragon work. It still had to deliver cargo to the ISS. It still had to land boosters. It still had to prove that reusability could work economically. But NASA's contract gave the company something it desperately needed: time and opportunity. And SpaceX used both. That's why the most important moment in this story may not have been the first successful landing. It may have been the moment NASA decided to give SpaceX a chance when the company had almost nothing to prove it deserved one. Imagine September 28, 2008 going differently. Falcon 1 launches. Something goes wrong. The rocket fails for the fourth time. SpaceX runs out of money. The company shuts down. There is no Falcon 9, no Dragon spacecraft developed in the same way, no reusable Falcon 9 boosters, no Starlink constellation built by SpaceX. And the commercial launch industry could have developed along a completely different path. That's what makes the story so remarkable. SpaceX wasn't guaranteed to win. It came incredibly close to losing. The company's future depended on a rocket that had already failed 3 times. And that final success created the evidence NASA needed to make one of the most consequential commercial space decisions in its history. NASA didn't choose SpaceX because it was the safest company in the room. It chose SpaceX because the company had demonstrated something different. It could build quickly. It could learn from failure. And it was willing to challenge assumptions that the industry had accepted for decades. SpaceX's story isn't really about Elon Musk. It's not even about Falcon 1. It's about what happened when failure became part of the development process instead of the end of it. The first launch failed. SpaceX learned. The second failed. SpaceX learned again. The third failed. The company was almost finished. Then the fourth launch succeeded. That one success created credibility. NASA provided contracts. Contracts supported development. Development produced Falcon 9. Falcon 9 created reusable rockets. Reusability changed launch economics. Starlink created another massive business around the launch system. And now Starship is pushing the same philosophy toward the Moon and Mars. The entire chain can be traced back to one moment when SpaceX had almost nothing left. One rocket, one launch, one chance. Today, SpaceX is one of the most influential companies in the space industry. But its rise wasn't inevitable. It began when the company was at its weakest, when NASA had every reason to be cautious, and when one failed launch could have erased everything. Maybe that's the real reason SpaceX changed the industry. It didn't win because it never failed. It won because failure didn't stop the process. Every failure became information. Every test became another iteration. And eventually, the company turned that process into an advantage that became harder and harder for competitors to catch. NASA didn't know exactly what SpaceX would become in 2008. Nobody did. But NASA gave the company a chance. SpaceX turned that chance into a revolution. And today, the question is no longer whether a small private company can compete with aerospace giants. The question is how far SpaceX can take the industry next. So what do you think was the most important moment in SpaceX's history? The fourth Falcon 1 launch, NASA's $1.6 billion contract, the first Falcon 9 landing, or the creation of Starlink? Let me know in the comments.